Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I just wanted to take a minute to welcome everybody to this. As Michael just said, the program today is Channeling Justice, very clever, television and the legal profession, and the conference here is co-sponsored by the law school and its Center on the Legal Profession. And we're actually really happy to see so many of you. It's a nice mixed audience that will enroll through the day, I should say, with students, faculty, people from the community, and so on. And of course, this is a subject of huge interest, how lawyers and law are represented in popular culture, and in particular on television, TV being by far, I think at this point it's fair to say, by far the most important medium for shaping popular perceptions generally. There have been literally hundreds of television shows about law and lawyers since the 1960s, and they've had enormous cultural impact. Millions of people learn most of what they know or think they know about law and lawyers from watching fictional shows about lawyers on television, court TV never having quite taken off. And I should say, I think this is a subject about which probably all of us think we also know a lot and have a lot to say. Going back to the days of Perry Mason and the defenders in the 1960s, through LA Law in the 1980s, Ally McBeal and The Practice in the 90s, Law and Order, I think forever, and then, most recently, The Good Wife, Boston Legal, and Harry's Law. Lawyers have been practicing in our living rooms for most of our lives. And I should say this conference is of particular interest to me. Personally, I grew up in one of those homes where the TV went on, whoever woke up first turned it on, whoever went to bed last turned it off. I remember cutting my teeth on Perry Mason as a little kid, which for some reason, despite its total formula, never failed to keep me gripped, and I don't think I ever correctly figured out who the murderer was. My first job out of college was as a paralegal. Not that you're interested in this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. My first job out of college was as a paralegal at Dewey Ballantine. This is in the very, very, very early days of the VCR, and they had a collection of instructional videos on cross-examination and on so on, and we found in their box they actually had the complete Perry Mason, which we watched, and showed this is just, everybody liked it. You actually felt like you were learning something about at least the dramatic side of lawyering and how you might want to present yourself. Shows about lawyers, like television in general, I think have gotten progressively better over the years, beginning really with LA Law, which was a kind of turning point in the way lawyers were presented on TV and changed everything about lawyer shows. The thing that I've written a fair amount of scholarship over the years, most of which no one has ever read. The thing that I did that has by far had the largest readership was at some point I did an interview for O Magazine, which is Oprah's magazine, on TV lawyers and which ones I like best and why. I got hundreds of responses to that. So this conference focuses on TV lawyers, as Michael said to me. These are their stories. What we're going to do over the course of the day is we'll talk about the lawyers, the TV lawyers. How does TV portray lawyers? Who are they? How do they practice law? What do we learn about ethics or about the way people think about legal ethics? What happens in law firms? What about women lawyers, prosecutors and defense lawyers and the differences between them? Are TV lawyers, noble campaigners for justice or hired guns who are in it for the money? We'll also spend some time in particular on the first panel exploring the business end of legal drama. Why do so many lawyer shows keep getting made? It's definitely a staple and has been straight through the years. Who comes up with the ideas for these new lawyer shows? What's it like to write them? What's it like to furnish technical advice? What's it like for an actor to play a lawyer? How do you think about that? We'll spend some time this afternoon talking about shows like Judge Judy and the many clones who dominate daytime television. Apparently, Judge Judy is one of the most popular shows on TV, more popular actually than Oprah, I was told, and ask questions about lawyer advertising, and which is also everywhere on daytime TV. One other personal story, when I was at the University of Chicago, I was in charge of the clerkship program, and we would place our students, in the Seventh Circuit, the Ninth Circuit, Courts of Appeals, the district courts, and one year I actually got a call from Judge Wapner, and we placed a Chicago law student with him. So that year when we published our report, it had, like student X, Posner, 7th Circuit, student Y, Kearse, 2nd Circuit, student Z, Wapner, Peoples. So, I hope this conference today will be fun. as well as informative. We also want to make it the first in what will be, we hope, an ongoing series about law and popular culture. It's an important topic for the profession, not to mention one that is both fun and interesting. Before we turn to the first panel, I do want to offer some special thanks and acknowledgments. First, I'd like to thank Deborah Rohde, who directs the Center for the Legal Profession and helped organize the conference. Not everyone in the academy, I suppose I should say, would so quickly realize the interest and importance of this topic to the profession. It's just one more thing among the millions of things that Deborah does for the law school and in the world. Second, we all owe thanks to Trish Gertridge and her staff, who, as always, have done a wonderful job pulling everything together and making everything work. We're blessed at the law school with an incredibly efficient and hardworking program support group. Working with academics is, I think, like working with actors, not always easy. My brother-in-law, who will be here this afternoon and started life as an agent, when I described my job to him, said, "Your job sounds exactly the same as mine, managing talent." Trish and her people, as always, though, have managed to whip everybody into shape, so thank you there. And finally, and most important, I'd like to thank Mike Asimov. Mike proposed the idea of holding this conference, and he did almost everything to make it happen. We're delighted that Michael has joined us after a prolonged stay in Los Angeles, and are grateful for his continued contributions to the school and to the profession. And now I'm going to switch hats, and we'll turn to the first panel, which is on the business end of legal television. Hi, my name's Larry Kramer. The first panel that we're taking up is Laws, Entertainment, and Business. That is to say, what goes into the process of creating and producing shows about lawyers, and in particular, how do the people who make those shows mediate between the realistic and the dramatic? Indeed, how much sense is there of a need to be realistic, and why? So we have an incredible panel to discuss those questions, including a producer who's also a writer, a legal consultant, and an actor. Their bio's in your program, so I'm not going to repeat what's there, and instead I'll do just a brief introduction before each speaker. So to begin the program, we're joined by David Kelley, who I suspect most of you know. David is a lawyer, also with a JD from BU, also a writer, and of course, producer of some of the best lawyer shows ever made. David started his career as a writer for LA Law, which I should say I think saw its ratings begin to decline exactly when he left after the 5th season. He then went on to produce such shows as The Practice, Ally McBeal, Boston Legal, and currently Harry's Law. We only have 90 minutes, so you are going to have to read the endless list of awards that he's won for this work, which would take the whole 90 minutes. So with that, let me turn it over to David to get us started.
Can I get up at the podium, or do you want me to sit here?
No, whatever. You can do whatever you want.
I'm comfortable doing either, except I'm sitting next to Camryn, and I wrote down some notes, and quite frankly, I'm afraid that she would look over, see my words, twist them, and interpret them in a way I never intended. So I'm going to stand up and speak from a safer distance. How many are, can I just start off, because I think the first rule is kind of knowing your audience. How many here are lawyers? All right, let me start off with an apology. I like to fish. I was at a lodge not too long ago, and we were having dinner around a table with a bunch of people. None of us knew each other, and everyone exchanging pleasantries on what we did for a living, and I mentioned that I wrote law shows, and a gentleman from Texas kind of dismissed me. He said, "Forgive me, but I've never seen them." He says, "I am a lawyer, and the last thing I want to do is go home at the end of the day and turn on my television and watch a show about the law." Conversation continued. Someone mentioned Boston Legal, and he said, "Wait," same Texas gentleman, wait, Boston Legal? I love that show. That has nothing to do with the actual practice of law." And so it is. 25 years ago, when I began on LA Law, Chuck Rosenberg was our legal consultant. Marshall, you were there, part of the writing staff. We actually prided ourselves on being as accurate as we could. Chuck would give meticulous notes to each script. If a lawyer attempted to assume facts not in evidence, we would be sure to have the other lawyer object. If the police ran amok of the exclusionary rule, the judge would weigh in on that as well. Now, quarter of a century later, Harry's Law, not so much. There's a reason for that. Things have changed in the 25 years, but before I get to the differences, I would like to just touch on one thing that hasn't changed. The reason I started writing about law shows, the reason I first went to law school, is because of my fascination with this legal system, this imperfect beast that we have that seeks to legislate the moral and ethical conduct of its citizenry. And the law really doesn't just tell us what we can and cannot do. It often suggests, at least, how we should feel and think sometimes. And it's not with a code of black and whites. As we know, when cases get interpreted, it's often with shades of gray. One of the perks of this job, in addition to getting invited to events like this, is you get other sort of interesting invitations. And I got one about 10, 11 years ago from Sandra Day O'Connor, who invited me to dinner at her home in Washington. I went on to find out that she has a dinner every year, and she and a friend of hers and an assistant, they sit down and they try to create this dinner, and they put together different people from different walks, put them at a dinner table, and just see what happens. I went to this dinner and was at a big table, and there was, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. I think the top neuroscientist, Chief Justice Rehnquist, was to my left. A pretty good cauldron of extraordinary people. So I felt daunted just to be at the table. I'd made my mind up right at the beginning, okay, I'm not going to talk, I'm just going to listen. I look across the table, and I see there's this woman, and I recognize this woman. Her name is Judge Rhea Zobel from the District Court of Massachusetts, Federal Court in Massachusetts, where I started practicing as a young, law associate. Judge Zobel was legendary. She was a brilliant judge, very active, a fierce questioner, an acute listener. Nobody wanted to stand up and appear before her, least of all a young first-year associate. I got that privilege as a first-year associate. I walked in there, and true to form, she grilled me about this point, that argument. I do remember surviving it, but barely, walking out fairly terrorized. And here, cut to 20 years later, I'm sitting at this table with all these daunting people, but I'm most afraid of, Cruella de Zobel over there across the table. The dinner starts, we're talking again. I'd made my mind up not to speak, and I was sort of looking down, cutting my piece of meat, and all I hear, soft voice, but it was a woman's voice, you should be ashamed of yourself. I didn't look up. I thought, the table got quiet. All I knew is someone at the table needed to be ashamed. I looked up. It was me, and it was her. And she started in, the things you do to give the legal profession a black eye. I turned on the television the other night, and you had two lawyers romantically involved with each other, arguing against each other in the same case. That is ridiculous. I would never allow that to happen in any one of my courtrooms. I swallow. I'm trying to think of something intelligent to respond with, and all of a sudden I hear, why not? I turn to my left. It's my new best friend, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He says, well, why not? He says, well, because there's a conflict. He says, yes, but so if they disclose the conflict, why not? I mean, I might exclude them, but it's not an absolute. Silence. I got through it. The dinner continued. And about 10 minutes later, she started it again. She said, I saw one not too long ago where you had an old man dying of Alzheimer's, and he came into court with his son, who was dying of heart failure, and he asked for a court order to give his heart to his son so a hospital could do the transplant. He says, that's preposterous. Beat, beat, beat. Why? Chief Justice Rehnquist coming to my defense again. He said, look, we allow for directed donations, organ donations. Physician-assisted suicide is debated and legalized in some states. Why would you necessarily rule out that? It then gave rise to a loud debate of this issue and that issue. Again, I tried to stay out of it. There's that adage, when the monkeys are fighting, when the elephants are fighting, the monkeys stay in the trees, and that's where I was happy to be. But it reminded me of why I went to law school, why I started writing about law shows, and that is, it is this imperfect beast that I spoke of. It's our best mechanism of society trying to navigate rights and wrongs, and it's not a perfect world. It's not a world of black and whites. It's a world of grays. Law is constantly evolving, and that's why I think law shows still can stay fresh to this day, because they do evolve. Now, much has changed. Let's talk about what's changed. First is the obvious, the production values. The technological advances of television have grown so dramatically in the last 25 years that shows about talking heads just have trouble competing. With the proliferation of shows like Lost and 24 and high-octane shows, very well produced, it becomes difficult to get the same dopamine rush from your viewer with a closing argument. We learn to adjust. Now our Q&As, the witness, instead of just telling what happened, we will cut to flashbacks. We try to be more filmic where we can. But the challenge to compete with these shows that have high-end production values, if you look at, for example, at Star Trek versus Battlestar Galactica and see how far television has grown, the challenges for a show that's primarily about dialogue remain large. Second of all, the presentation. When we were doing LA Law, you remember Marshall and Chuck, we had 48 minutes to tell a story in 4 acts. Now we're down to 41 minutes in 6 acts. That means between every 6 and 7 minutes, we now have to break for a commercial. And it's a loud commercial. If you've watched TV, you know that the networks boost up the volume, the decibel level of their commercials, because that's what they truly want you to hear. So every 6 minutes, you're being pounded with a Dodge Ram commercial or the like. And it puts a burden on the producers and the storytellers to be just as loud, to be just as noisy, to be just as bombastic. Now, what do? Again, maybe we go for action instead of dialogue. Maybe we decide to hire loud, noisy, bombastic actors to interpret your words. But the challenges are there. Then there's also the DNA of the viewer. Our DNA is just different. I watch television with my daughter. She's got her computer out. She's got her smartphone. She's doing her homework. She's looking. They multitask. That's the way we're bouncing around. Again, the arousal levels of the average viewer are not what they were 25 years ago. You simply don't get the same attention span. So we have to adjust. Will the law franchise ever become extinct? I think not, because the architecture of the law show still remains very, very sound. You've got good guys versus bad guys. You've got conflict at the center of each episode. Often it's good versus evil. Your protagonist is able to champion, if not further, the cause of the underdog. And the truth is people like law shows. They like law as much as we always hear people love to hate lawyers. They also love to love them. Their worlds are very exciting, or can be. They walk into these forums and argue these big arguments that affect society. Now, in truth, is the practice of law nearly as interesting as we portray it? No. Probably the biggest disservice that we do is we send the message that justice is swift. Anything but. Litigation is a course of last resort in the world of law. On television, it's the first place we go to. Settlements make for bad television. So there's a crime or a breach in Act 1, and you're in trial in Act 2. We just go from 0 to 60 because we have to, again, to compete with our shorter acts, to compete with the higher octane competition. As a result, I think people sometimes think they can go to a lawyer and get justice as fast as they can go to a doctor and get a prescription for a sore throat and be better in a few days. It doesn't work that way. But I do think the law franchise will always be viable. I do think that the ability to intellectually challenge audiences on your best episodes, maybe emotionally move them, is a real luxury and opportunity for the storyteller, and the law franchise presents that opportunity on a weekly basis. Obviously, shows need to be fresh week in and week out. With law shows, you get to cycle in new crises through different clients, just like the police show does it with victims and the doctor show do it with patients. The lawyer shows will have their clients. I think it's here to stay. There's more pressure on us to do it better. We have still many good law shows. I think The Good Wife is remarkably well done. So I don't think that the franchise is facing extinction, but it has changed. It has evolved in 25 years. We do face challenges that were not there. I think that's my best overview of the television franchise. I've spoken on panels with Camryn Manheim before. I'm telling you, it's a real disadvantage to go first and let her have at you second. I'm taking my chances, but I think we were allotted 12 minutes, and I think I better hold on to 1 or 2 just because I'm not sure what she's going to do.
Thank you. By the way, wasn't Raya Zobel a character? What's that? Wasn't Raya, one of the shows, I thought it was The Practice, Raya Zobel was the judge. Or it was Zaya Robel or something like that. I remember watching it and saying to my wife, that's Raya Zobel. I know her.
I try to get even with a lot of people. I make them characters on the show. I'm careful not to make anything that could possibly be interpreted as the truth, because I made that mistake, quite frankly, early in my career. I just made the name of a plaintiff, a friend of mine, and lo and behold, it was close to a case that was actually happening. So I learned my lesson. If I'm going to use names, I better be careful to be so far away from the truth that it couldn't possibly be misinterpreted. But I wouldn't be surprised if
Somebody did.
If I used a Zobel. I still consider her a judicial terrorist. She was a brilliant judge. She still is a brilliant judge. But for a first-year associate, not a fun experience.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Marshall Goldberg. Marshall graduated from this law school in 1971. So I did a little quick research, and I found this is the limits of Wikipedia, I learned, because it said on there that he'd started writing about doctors for what was also a wonderful TV show, Dr. Kildare, but that was 1962, and I thought that seemed a little early, and he just confirmed, no, he had not done that. Some other Marshall Goldberg had written for Dr. Kildare, but Marshall has written for quite a number of shows, including quite a number of lawyer shows, such as LA Law, also in the early great years, The Paper Chase, and quite a few others. So, Marshall, we'll talk a little bit about writing.
I will follow David's lead and go to the podium. There's a story in Ball 4, the Jim Bouton book, on Major League Baseball where the pitchers are going over the opposing lineup with the pitching coach before a game. And they get to the first batter, and the coach says, brush him back twice, then throw 3 curveballs over the outside corner. They get to the second batter, and the pitching coach says, brush him back twice, then throw 3 curveballs over the outside corner. They get to the third batter, same thing. And finally, Boughton speaks up and says, Skip, if I could throw 3 curveballs over the outside corner, I wouldn't need to brush anyone back twice. Now, very few people, even at the major league level, can throw 3 curveballs over the outside corner, but in TV writing, David Kelley can. He is a phenomenon in the industry. There is simply no one like him in our business. Now, when I heard David was on the panel, I was going to yield to him the balance of my time and tell all of you just to listen closely and take good notes. But then I thought, maybe I have something to contribute after all. I don't know if I'm a ham and egger exactly, but I do think I'm more typical of those who make a living writing for television. After all, most people can't throw 3 curveballs over the outside corner. And I may just shake things up and make Larry work for his pay as moderator today. Larry's question was, how do we mediate between the dramatic and realistic in presenting what lawyers do on television? And I know we're here to talk about lawyers, but I think the question applies to all of television. How important is authenticity? Now, speaking as a writer who's worked in the industry for 30 plus years, the short answer is authenticity doesn't matter much at all. Let me give 2 personal experiences as examples of why I say that. 5 years into my writing career, I was the head writer on a show called Paper Chase about students at an elite law school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was the perfect job for me. I knew law school, I knew Cambridge. I could show the world the fascinating side of being a law student, the ethical and legal conflicts, the battles between the mind and the heart. And if it wasn't accurate enough, we had Chuck Rosenberg to make sure we got there. The series was exactly what I wanted it to be and more. There were terrific actors and directors and stories, and the show was critically acclaimed. The only problem was it was the 1980s, and the series was on Showtime, a cable network that measured its viewers by the dozen. My life became a variation on the classic question of, if a TV is on and no one watches it, does it make a sound? But looking back, the real lesson with Paper Chase was what was incredibly realistic and appealing to me wasn't of much interest to anyone else. The counterexample came right after Paper Chase. Stephen Bochco, the creator and producers of one of the great shows in television history, Hill Street Blues, was starting a series about a law firm in Los Angeles. And I was hired to be on the writing staff the first year of the show. I expected a similar experience to Paper Chase, just set in a law firm rather than a law school. But Bochco was not interested in how real lawyers worked, or rather, he was interested only to the extent it led to a dramatic story. Bochco wanted to attract viewers. As he put it, our job is to fill the time between the commercials. The characters were fun and wacky, but the law firm in LA law was totally foreign to me, so foreign that I would describe the show as about a law firm on another planet. But the show was wildly successful because Bochco was on to something. People want to watch interesting characters and interesting stories. Nothing else really matters. Nothing. Took me a long time to realize that as a writer. If that lesson had taken 20 years ago, I might be a rich man by now. In television, a writer is creating and conveying a world. It looks like our everyday world, but it's an entirely different universe with completely different rules. Conflict is good, harmony is bad. There has to be a nice demographic mix of age, ethnicity, politics, sexual orientation, skin tone, hair color. Everyone speaks with the same accent. The main characters have to be likable. The show has to be sexy. Stories take place in formerly 12 to 15, now 8 to 10 minute segments that end with a twist and are followed by commercials. And the stories usually are tied up neatly after an hour. That's very different from the world we live in. Now, people tend to forget that these are two different worlds. I've read that Hugh Laurie, the actor who plays Dr. House on TV, is constantly approached for diagnoses. And Sam Waterston from Law & Order is constantly asked for legal advice. And the same is true in the other direction. In Tootsie, Dustin Hoffman plays an actor, and in the opening scene, he's cast as a tomato in a commercial, but won't sit on a park bench. And the director gets exasperated and asks him why, and he says, "A tomato wouldn't sit on a park bench." But these worlds are different. Remember, we go into the world of television or literature to escape our own world or to learn lessons we can apply to our world. On Sunday mornings, I teach a Torah class, and I've been doing it for 14 years now. Some people do take the Bible literally and deny global warming because they say God promised not to destroy the world after Noah and the flood. But my students never confuse the two worlds. That's why the Torah is kept in an ark behind closed doors. It's another world that we visit every so often. I look at shows on television the same way. It's often an interesting world and a fun world, but it's not our world. Now, speaking as a writer who makes his living in that other world, I say law shows are not really about lawyers. Law shows are about characters who operate in a legal setting. The same is true for medical shows and cop shows. In fact, the lawyers on law shows have much more in common with doctors on medical shows and cops on police shows than with lawyers in real life. I saw where one actor who starred on Three Rivers is now on Hawaii Five-0, and he went from a transplant doctor in Pittsburgh to a cop in Honolulu. And I saw another actress go from playing a lawyer on Lie to Me to a cop on Chicago Code. We go along with it because they are interchangeable. And I don't mean that as necessarily a negative. This is just how I see that world work. It's all about the characters, and the settings are simply springboards for the characters. Law and medicine and law enforcement create inherently dramatic situations that touch on some basic emotions. That's why 95% of all dramatic shows on television fall into one of those three categories. And different writers are better at exploiting one setting more than another, just as some athletes are better at playing one sport than another. But the differences among the three shows are not like football, basketball, and hockey. It's more like tennis, squash, and racquetball. Now, implicit in Larry's question is a wish for the TV world for lawyers to be more like real life. And I think that's natural, but I also think it's quixotic. For one thing, there's the paper chase experience where too much concern with authenticity leads to a shrinking audience. And for another, there's the havoc it would wreak if you break down the separation between the two worlds. I remember in radio days, Josh Mostel plays this character who's overweight and walks around and like struggling to get by, and he's in a sleeveless t-shirt, and he's married to Julie Kavner, who's kind of the female equivalent. And she says to him, "Would you rather be married to me or Rita Hayworth?" And he says, "Do you have to ask?" Now, so how much is authenticity actually needed? I say only enough to make the audience suspend disbelief. Now, that obviously varies with the audience. I have doctor friends who won't watch medical shows because they think they're preposterous, but they never miss CSI. And I know cops who won't watch cop shows for the same reason, but they're hooked on Grey's Anatomy. Now, some writers can handle the differences in universes better than others. Me, I always had problems writing for lawyer shows. I wrote just about every kind of show there is on television. Comedies, dramas, light, heavy. I wrote animation, I wrote features. But I kind of began to shy away from writing law shows. They just made me too crazy. It was like going away for the weekend with someone who is the spitting image of your ex-spouse. I'm still enough of a lawyer that I need grounding in reality, so my scripts tend to feel more authentic than most, but I honestly think objectively it's unnecessary. I'll see a medical show where a doctor will operate on a family member, or a law show where a lawyer will sit silently in the courtroom while the other side says, "And what did they say?" And those things just make me crazy. But the ratings indicate that most people don't seem to mind at all. My time is about up, but I want to close with a story of my first real encounter with Hollywood. I had a story pitching session with Different Strokes, a show about a wealthy white man who adopts 2 black boys to live with him and his teenage daughter. This is my first job. And I went in to present my story ideas to the producers. And 3 of them were sitting there, 2 on the couch, 1 behind the desk. And you present your stories, and if they like a story, they'll hire you to write it. And the 2 on the couch were just fascinated with my background. They asked me about Stanford, and I worked in the Senate, and I worked in the Civil Rights Division at Justice, and I worked in the presidential campaign, and they're asking me all about it. And the 3rd guy is sitting behind the desk, listening quietly, but getting impatient. And finally he says, "Yeah, well, Marshall, all that doesn't mean shit out here. Let's hear your stories." I thought he was talking about my credentials, but I later came to realize he was talking about my knowledge. Thank you.
So while Marshall sits down, just 2 quick comments. One is the next time you choose to write a show about an elite law school, feel free to set it in Palo Alto. And just as a thought for you, when we get to the Q&A part, I think actually it's not so much that most of us wish that TV was more like real life as that we wish real life was more like TV, especially in the legal profession as regards speed and also fees, since nobody seems to ever get broken by that. But the real issue is then how does that presentation affect people's expectations when they get to the real world? Yeah, he would have. For our 3rd speaker, actually, we get the perspective that most of us in this room, to the extent that we think about this as something we'd like to do, this is what we fantasize ourselves able possibly to do. That is to say, I'm pretty sure I could never be an actor or a writer. I just don't have the talent. Not that it doesn't take talent for this, but being a legal consultant is something where our expertise potentially would be usable. So our 3rd speaker we get the perspective of one of the top legal consultants in the country. Chuck Rosenberg graduated from Harvard Law School in 1971, practiced with Tuttle and Taylor and Heller Ehrman in LA before opening his own shop about a decade ago. And while serving startup companies, he has continued, though, to be a legal consultant on such shows as Boston Legal, The Practice, LA Law, Paper Chase. So, as I say, you've got the job that most of us think, oh, I would love to do, and just so you know, I would love to do that someday if you ever do a show on constitutional history. That's about all I can do. Chuck Rosenberg.
And my publicist would kill me if I said I am not also the author of a novel that's currently up on Amazon called Death on a High Floor. Currently available as a Kindle ebook and coming out in print in June. It's a murder mystery about the murder of the managing partner of a large law firm. Check it out. Anyway, so I went over to the creative side. This began for me literally 29 years ago when I got a call from a woman named Lynn Roth, who was the executive producer of Paper Chase. And she said somehow or other they'd lost their legal consultant. I don't know why exactly. And she asked me if I'd like to do it. And I said, well, I've never read a TV script. And I said, what are you looking for? And she said, well, we're looking for technical advice to get it right, but also sometimes for other things, like we currently have a classroom scene where we need a theme. Our theme of our show is about commitment. And I said, how about the gratuitous promise cases? At the time, I was a law professor at UCLA. And I described those to her, and I said, so it's about when is a statement of promise, when's it a commitment? She said, it's perfect, you're hired. Okay. Since then, I've read hundreds of TV scripts, and I've been privileged to have them written by some of the best writers in television, not just of legal shows, but of any show. And I'm one of those people, two of whom are sitting beside me. And I'm one of those people who, as a result, can see the writing in things. If they're badly written, I can sit there and just see the people in a writer's room yucking it up as they write the lines. If it's well written, I can't. And that's true of movies, too. And what I thought about doing today is talking about what I've learned from that and about television consulting, and thinking about, well, if a new consultant came to me and said, I've just been hired, what should I do? I'd try to give that person some advice, and here's the advice I'd give. I'd say, first of all, you have to remember that television is a visual medium. And that seems obvious, you watch it. But the result of it being a visual medium is there has to be some motion in it. People can't be, as David said, talking heads. They can't just stand there and address a judge at a microphone. And that has implications for depicting reality. One of them is, if in a federal courtroom a lawyer is chained to a podium, as we are in Los Angeles, they can't be chained to the podium in a television show. If you have to ask the judge for permission to approach the witness, which is the case in most courtrooms, you can't do that on a TV show because it just freezes the thing. Nor can you say that lawyers won't lean on the jury rail or do any number of other things that are actually forbidden. You just forget about it. You're not going to be able to do that. Another thing I think to keep in mind, I'm using my new little iPad here, is television is an emotional medium. And the result of that is that you don't have the time or the ability to explain things to people in an analytical manner. And so constitutional history would be difficult, I think. And so it's an emotional medium, and you have to keep in mind that what you're not doing is explaining the law to people. And so you have to get at the law really through what I call emotional policy issues. If you're going to do a show on abortion, you really can't talk about the penumbra of the Ninth Amendment and privacy. You've got to do it in some way that people can connect to within a legal context. Also, and David referred to this, television is a time-limited medium, which means that if you've got now 41 or 42 minutes to do a show, you simply don't have time to go through the rigmarole of objection, sustained, ask that the answer be struck from the record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You just don't have time to do that. And you also have to keep in mind that that really wraps into the earlier comment about it being an emotional medium. You just can't go into the analysis because of the time. Even if an audience would sit there and listen to you explain a constitutional issue, there's no time to do it, even if you wanted to do it and even if the audience would listen to it. So another thing is if you're a consultant and you want someone to change a line because you think it's blatantly wrong or not quite right, you have to suggest something that will replace that line in the same amount of time and with the same rhythm, okay, and with the same staccato beat or whatever they're going for. Let me state something that may be shocking to an audience mostly of lawyers. Correct procedure isn't really very important. And what I've come to think over the years is, first of all, procedure varies tremendously right now from courthouse to courthouse and courtroom to courtroom within a courthouse. I've been in many courtrooms, and partly as a result of having been associated with these shows, I've been invited to many courtrooms. And they're all different. And I've had people say to me things like, I can't remember what the event was, but somebody said, I said to the writer, that would never, ever happen in real life, ever. Okay? And some lawyer came up to me at a bar conference and said, you know that thing that happened on the show? I just saw that exact thing. And this morning I was reading on my BlackBerry an ABA email, and it was talking about a prosecutor who had just convicted a murderer of a felony murder, and the guy got up and decked him, okay, to put the punch to the jaw, and then according to this, the prosecutor got up and pushed him back over the rail, and they scuffled on the floor until the sheriff's deputies broke it up. So if you did that on a TV show, somebody might say, well, you know, that never happened. Well, it just happened. You know, the result about procedure is that a lot of it's going to get shorthanded, and you know, I just don't think it's really very important in the great scheme of things. There is something that's important, and I think most TV shows honor it, and that is the basic constitutional procedural protections are honored on TV shows. You have a right to a trial by jury. You get to confront the witnesses against you and the right to cross-examine them. You get the right to counsel. You get the right to remain silent if you wish to. And good writers take all those issues and work with them. And so those things are protected and honored in most legal TV shows that I've worked with. But as for exact procedure, no. Do you want the procedural terminology to be right? Sure. And so one of the things I used to do was correct the terminology from time to time. Although even that was sometimes a little bit of a challenge because, for example, Boston Legal was set in Massachusetts, where I don't practice. And so I had to learn what the procedural terminology was in Massachusetts, which wasn't really all that difficult to do. Another thing is talking about audience, that lawyers are simply not the main audience for lawyer shows. And I've often asked myself the question, are they a validating audience? You know, is it important to have lawyers go around and tell other lawyers or people this is a great show? I'm not sure. But the audience is mainly not lawyers, and writers aren't writing for lawyers. You think that's right, Marshall? David? Just not writing for lawyers. And so, and also it's interesting to me, the lawyer audience itself has changed. When LA Law first came out, a lot of lawyers used to come up to me and criticize certain things about the show. They would say things like, gosh, cases go to trial too quickly. And I'd say, well, what? You'd like it to go to trial in the 5th year of the show? And now people don't say that anymore. So I think lawyers have been educated themselves about what these shows are going to be like. And let me address something that is perhaps controversial. I've taught for 10 years at Loyola a course called Law and Popular Culture, and the issue that always comes up is how much do these shows influence people? And my belief, perhaps contrary to those of most people in the room and on these panels today, is not very much. I think the arrow likely runs in the other direction, and what I mean by that is writers of these shows live in the world. They get their inspirations from the world. They then, sure, they massage them, or if you want, distort them to make shows. But one of the things I've become interested in my class is the question of where do people get their information about the legal system? And if you add up all the places that people have actual contact with the legal system, there are millions of units of those. For example, in California, there are 1 million people in prison, not just in jails, but in state prison. If you thought that there were a minimum of 3 people, which is probably low, that had contact with the justice system as a result of those imprisonments, would include the prisoner, victim, where often there's a victim, the witnesses, the jurors who heard the case. That's millions of units of contact with the justice system. And that adds up to a lot of impressions about how it works. As for people forming impressions about procedure, I've talked to a number of judges about that who say, yeah, people come into my courtroom and they have an idea about the procedure should go this way. But in the truth, I just tell them it's not that way. And most people say, oh, okay. Because I think audiences in the end are smart. And sometimes I think people don't give audiences enough credit for being smart. But they are. And sure, you know, if 1/10 of 1% of the people in the United States are utterly stupid, that leaves 300,000 people to ask Hugh Laurie for medical advice. And so I just kind of don't really buy it that much. I think it has some impact, but I don't think it's the main driver of what people think about the justice system. People thought bad things about lawyers in the justice system long before the first piece of celluloid ran through a projector. And so I guess what I'd say is, and you know, in the end you have to have a story. You have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have to have conflict and resolution and denouement. You have to have characters who are interesting. And so the role of a legal advisor, if they're any good, I think, is to help writers mine reality for better drama. I think that's what you're really doing, in addition to correcting the little incorrect things. So that's what I had to say.
Thank you. So finally, we're delighted to welcome Camryn Manheim to offer some thoughts from an actor's perspective. Camryn's recognizable from countless roles in TV and film. For present purposes, I suppose she's best known for playing Eleanor on The Practice, a role that earned her both an Emmy and a Golden Globe. I loved The Practice, except I do have to say by the later seasons, everybody seemed to be yelling at each other all the time for the entire hour. On a personal note, I should say, among many other roles, Camryn also had a regular part in The Ghost Whisperer. I don't know how many of you have watched Ghost Whisperer. I watch it religiously with my daughter, who loves it. And when I mentioned that, Camryn, apparently assuming that this would be a matter of embarrassment for the dean of a law school, promised to keep my secret if I would admit her child to Stanford. So I've outed myself on Ghost Whisperer, but I will do my best, I promise. Anyway, Camryn?
Thank you. So when I filled out my registration form, they asked me my credentials, and I said, Camryn Manheim, David Kelley School of Law, Esquire, NBC, CBS, ABC, SAG, IOU, OMG, and LOL, because I thought that would, you know, pretty much sum up my legal my legal studies. But well, you guys are all familiar with Julius Caesar's famous line, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. But there's a lesser-known Latin expression that only, well, probably you legal scholars would know, venio, video, vincio, which means I'm here because I played a lawyer on TV, and if David Kelley wrote my closing argument, I could kick your ass in court. Before my cameos on Law & Order and winning the part of Eleanor Frutt on The Practice, my entire legal career consisted of a couple of traffic tickets and suing my father in small claims court for unpaid wages and punitive damages. This is true, Manheim versus Manheim, 1975, and the court delivered a verdict for Manheim. I was undefeated going into my audition for The Practice, which is probably why David hired me for the part. But as Bertolt Brecht once said, art is not a mirror to hold up to society, but a hammer in which to shape it. And as an idealistic young actor, I believed that storytelling was an important part of shaping our future. And if you're lucky, you actually get to be a part of something that accomplishes that. And that's why being on The Practice was an amazing experience for me. Obviously, I can't disclose privileged lawyer-client communications, but I felt like David and I were on the same page most of the time, when it came to social issues at least. And I will say that it was a satisfying part of being on a television show to gently and quietly provoke people to just think about some of these ideas that we presented. I believe that law is as much a part of America's popular culture as is television, and together they kind of form our civic religion. They both shape our beliefs, our fears, and our aspirations. And I would venture to say that some of our meaningful law reform that you would find in the courts or Congress often first came off in screenplays. To Kill a Mockingbird, 12 Angry Men, Inherit the Wind, Anatomy of a Murderer, Kramer versus Kramer, the list goes on and on. Thus, I often think of myself as a class action lawyer, where the class I represent is the American viewing public, or at least that segment of it that doesn't watch Fox News. They're kind of a class all unto themselves. I became a lot like my character, and she became a little like me. So it was with great sadness that I got disbarred in 2004 when David dissolved the law firm and retained Captain Kirk as his new lawyer. I guess he wanted to boldly go where no producer had ever gone before. Yet one of these days, I will face off against Denny Crane in the Romulan Supreme Court. Won't he be surprised when strict scrutiny is applied in a very new and creative way? I come from a long line of activists, and I have had a hard time always keeping my mouth shut. And one of the great lessons I learned while being on the practice was to pick my battles carefully. I learned not to complain to the writers and producers with every de minimis injury to my sense of aesthetic justice. I had to act strategically, presenting my best claims and forgoing my weaker ones. I limited my prayers for relief to restitution and rewrites rather than forcing the writers to publicly confess error every week. I'm sure many of you who are students have learned about strategic lawyering in your advocacy classes. Well, I learned it at the David Kelley School of Law. During the first year of the practice, I was living in my brother's guest house. He happens to be a professor of constitutional law, so you can imagine the lively conversations at our dinner table. He actually tried to convince me that Justice Jackson's 3-part test in Youngstown actually had 5 parts, and he said he wouldn't charge me rent if I could spell justiciability. See what I'm talking about? Wasn't that fun? Okay. The language of the law may have a lot of Latin and French in it, but it was all Greek to me when I started looking at it. Nunc pro tunc and voir dire sounded to me like agio me tritos me dias assitu, which, as many of you legal scholars will know, has nothing to do with the law. That was the motto over the entrance to Plato's Academy. It meant, let no one untrained in geometry enter. And I think with a little work, it could be a very good motto for Stanford Law School, because it sounds a little better than Die Luft der Freiheit wett. So living with a lawyer, I actually learned some law rather than simply memorizing lines. Thus, I know that you can file an interlocutory appeal under 28 U.S.C. 1292, but that the collateral order rule is actually 1291, is a 1291 appeal. But for the most part, I tried to understand those words my character spoke. So when the character on the practice, Stuart Donovan, was sitting on death row in episodes 75 through 77, I knew that our ineffective assistance of counsel claim was made all the harder by the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act that President Clinton had recently signed. Sometimes I wondered if he was actually a liberal. In another arc on the practice, I fought the execution of Denise Freeman, a rehabilitated death row prisoner who had devoted her prison time to helping younger inmates, and in a last-ditch effort to stay her execution, my character Eleanor based an appeal on the medication the court ordered Denise to take at trial, which prevented the jury from observing her schizophrenia. I personally believe that executing the mentally ill, or anyone for that matter, is both morally and legally wrong, and it takes writers like David Kelley to counter those degenerate views of Rambo and Mel Gibson, who are also trying to shape public opinions of the law. And I disagree with Chuck in a way, and it's kind of scary because he's a big professor and all, but what?
Maybe more than in a way.
Because I do think that people are watching television and getting a lot of advice on the legal system. And it's hard to know how much influence shows like The Practice have had on the slowly changing public attitudes, particularly about capital punishment. But they are moving in the right direction, and since that time, 2 states have abolished capital punishment, and more are considering doing so. So public attitudes have definitely changed, And I would like to think we have a little part of that. It was because of my time on the practice that I got very involved in the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Death Penalty Focus, and Bet Sedek, the House of Justice. And the knowledge I learned during my tenure there really inspired me to get involved. And it was really from the scripts and some research that I did that said, you know, these things need to be addressed in a more drastic way. And this is a true story. I one day was sitting at out to lunch when this young man came up to me. He was a lawyer, and he said, I just watched that episode with Alfre Woodard and the schizophrenia case, and I want you to know that I've changed my attitude about the death penalty. And for someone who's a anti-death penalty activist, that was, you know, just doesn't get any better than that. So last month, I guest starred on David's new, loud, bombastic, noisy legal show, Harry's Law. And I played Assistant District Attorney Kim Mendelsohn in another death penalty case. And when I arrived on set, I instinctively went over to the defense table, because that's where I'd been all those years, and I forgot that I was the prosecutor seeking an execution. And the other table just didn't feel right to me. I had to shift my passion. And when David called and asked if I would argue the case, he said, you know, I know you're gonna try to put this guy, you know, on death row and keep him there and have him executed. But he said, look, you know, it will be so effective because the viewing audience really trusts you after playing Eleanor for 8 years. And even though I wasn't playing Eleanor anymore, they still afforded me that confidence that I banked over my years on the practice. In the episode, the law was clearly on the prosecutor's side. And people don't know about these stories. Many of us have experience with the legal system, being in jail, the millions of people who are in jail, but many of us have never met or know anyone who's been on death row. And this death row inmate's appeal wasn't filed on time due to a clerical error in a mailroom. But the Supreme Court exalts form over substance in death penalty cases, and the rule known as state procedural default operates to prevent review of the merits of a conviction. This episode closely resembled the real-life case Coleman versus Virginia, where Roger Coleman was executed in 2002 after his pro bono lawyer missed a filing deadline by 1 day because that day fell on a Saturday, so they filed it on a Monday. So my only hope as Kim Mendelsohn, the prosecuting attorney, you know, to impart anything of substance to the viewing audience was to deliver my colloquy with the defense counsel with as much passion as possible, calling attention to the rule that actual innocence is not as important as legal formalism. So I know I'm just an actor, but I actually take some of this seriously, and I read it, I research it, I'm interested in it, and to find out that that case was based on a real case it just, you know, fueled my outrage. So nonetheless, Harry's Law and my role as Kim presented the issues to the American jury, I believe, fully and mostly fairly, and I'm sure millions of more people know about the character that we portrayed on Harry's Law. Even millions of them know about his pending execution, while I'm sure nobody really knew about Roger Coleman. And there, in a nutshell, is television's impact on the law, at least to me. It is fair to say that most people's opinion about capital punishment and criminal law in general are shaped, at least a little bit, by television and by reality, maybe even more, who knows? Most people's exposure to American legal system is through television and movies. Books and print media come in a distant second, and actual exposure to the seamy side of the law hardly registers in the American psyche. Even the internet presents law through a filter. It's just a vehicle to access all the other media that I just mentioned. So it would be interesting to see the relative number of hits that Harry's Law gets on CBS.com versus the number of hits you'll see on SupremeCourt.gov for a real case. In fact, I wonder how many people in this room regularly visit SupremeCourt.gov and how many of you have Hulu.com bookmarked instead. I mean, I rest my case, right? Over the 168 episodes we shot on The Practice, we tackled a wide array of important legal issues that just got people to think. Discrimination, racism, freedom of speech, mass torts, tobacco companies, how pesticides are used to preserve children's playground equipment and then leach into the earth causing cancer. Things I never, ever thought of before I was watching these sorts of shows. And that's where David Kelley and other writer-creators come in. They really are a bridge, I believe, between the impenetrable legal system and American consciousness. The average American viewer doesn't know whether a televised case is factual or contrived, and they're not going to do the research to see if it really is. It really possesses, it's a dilemma since they're looking to us for the truth. Maybe we just need a code of ethics, right, for the broadcast industry so they don't distort the law or the facts, because that would be the surest way to get Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, and O'Reilly off the air. So I'm all for that, even if it, squelches our First Amendment rights. After The Practice ended its run, I got the producers to donate a complete set of tapes to the Loyola Law School library because the show presents real-world ethical problems. And I'm not kidding you, and you can check this out, Chuck, because I know you still work at Loyola. There are professors there that use the practice tapes in their ethical classes as part of the course of instruction at the law school. So it's kind of a different kind of rerun, only I don't get paid for residuals there. Of course, some viewers cannot distinguish fantasy from reality. When I was called to jury duty, a fan asked me for an autograph, and I wrote my usual, if you ever need a good lawyer, give me a call. And she's like, okay, thank you. And then she turned around and she goes, do you mind giving me your phone number? And I said, why? And she went, well, I was wondering if you could represent me in a pending matter I have. And I said, oh, honey, I'm not really a lawyer. I just play one on TV. And she said, oh, God, of course, I'm so sorry. And she felt really silly. And I was kind of shocked, And then a few months later, I was flying to Vancouver. And let's just say I don't like to fly. I really don't like to fly. I was sitting next to a man who seemed oddly familiar, but I couldn't really place him. And it was a really interesting plane ride. I had a very peaceful flying experience, and I didn't really know why. I was calm, and for the first time, I didn't spend the bulk of my trip wondering what part of the plane would fall off midair, or if the captain was playing video games, or if the air traffic controllers were taking a nap. And then when we landed, someone across the aisle called out to my seatmate and said, hey, Richard. And then I realized, oh my God, that's Richard Dean Anderson. That's why I felt so comfortable on the flight. He played MacGyver on TV. And I really must have subconsciously known that if anything happened, MacGyver would have safely landed my plane. So I guess we all kind of see reality through the camera lens. And luckily for viewers, through people like David Kelley's eyes, we get to get some good stuff along the way. So my closing advice to all of you, in light of all of this, if you're going to have a lawyer in the family, it should be someone useful, like a divorce lawyer or a tax attorney or someone who plays a lawyer on TV. My brother, the constitutional lawyer, is really utterly useless in real life. He couldn't even help me when I sued my dad for restitution. So something about a conflict of interest, or was it state procedural default? I don't know. But in any case, if you do need a good lawyer, you should give me a call.
So we'll take questions from the audience. There are microphones on either side because we are trying to record this. So go over there. And while people get there, I'm going to take the first question, which is raised by Camryn's presentation and something we didn't really touch on, which is the relationship between all this and politics. And I mean, it is interesting. I tell my students, I used to assign LA law, by the way, when I taught evidence. Same idea. The rulings were wonderful things to talk about the next day. But I often tell my students that if they really want to effectuate social change, actually being a lawyer isn't the way to do it, except on a retail level, that if you want to produce broad social change, go to Hollywood, make TV movies, because they have a much more profound influence. So I am curious. On the other hand, the way politics has gone over the last generation, as against most of the shows, which I think most people would agree are fairly liberal in their politics. So I am curious just to get your reactions on how you mediate as writers and producers, advice, whatever, how you mediate that conflict, how self-conscious you are, how you think about why no one ever gets an abortion, all of those issues that touch on the relationship of politics to viewers to what you're trying to
Let me say
accomplish.
something as a consultant about that. I thought it was my job to be the balance police, so that in reading scripts, I often tried to get the writers to tell the other side. Now, in fairness, they often did without my having to say that, but sometimes I would look at an argument, a policy argument in effect being made in a script and say, well, there is another side. And I still remember there was a script basically attacking the maximum security prison Pelican Bay. And I said, yeah, but you have to acknowledge the problem they've got, which is you've got these prisoners who kill other prisoners. So you need to acknowledge that somehow, and that got done. So, I think I regarded myself as the balance police, so.
Well, historically in my shows, I try to stay away from taking sides. In fact, we were primarily interested in the issues and the questions, but we never felt it was our place or should be to provide our version of the answer. If an issue didn't have two sides to it, we were not interested really in exploring it. That changed a little bit with Boston Legal. Boston Legal, we preached on Boston Legal sometimes. And that was because Boston Legal existed in a time where debate was considered unpatriotic. All of a sudden, you were less American if you stood up and dissented. And where I'd always felt that it was irresponsible for a producer or a show to use its program as a soapbox, now for the first time I felt, it might be somewhat irresponsible to have this forum and not use it. So Boston Legal became a little bit of a town crier. I think that's what that series in many ways was at its nucleus, besides the relationship of our two lead characters. But in general, you're looking not to provide the answers to your viewers. You really want them just to confront the question and to maybe examine their own values on a given issue.
To answer your question, Larry, about for Hollywood having so many liberals, why hasn't it seemed to offset the balance of what's happening politically? There was a time when you spoke out, your peers would come around you and support you, and you didn't feel like your life was in danger. I recall on the evening of the Golden Globes, it was the night before the impeachment hearing for Bill Clinton. And I won a Golden Globe, and in my speech I said, I dedicate this award to every single senator who votes to dismiss the case tomorrow. And when I got home, I got so much hate mail, people going, we don't want to hear what you have to say, you're just an actor. And it was very scary. And before I stood up on that stage, there was Warren Beatty, Dustin Hoffman. No one said a thing about what was happening in the political climate at that time. There's a fear now in Hollywood, and particularly with actors, to stand up and be controversial. And it's, I think it's a problem, because we are citizens and have things to say, and things matter to us, and we're not all just stupid actors, just some of us. But it is, and then, I got 30 or 40 really strong, angry emails for saying that. And that was the same night of the Golden Globes. And about 3 weeks later, the liberal people started writing in going, that was really cool what you said. I'm like, too late. That's how we're going to lose the election. You're too late.
Bill, it kind of sent shockwaves through our industry. Bill Maher had a show on ABC called Politically Incorrect, and he got fired by ABC for being too politically incorrect. It was right after 9/11 when everybody had to fall in patriotic line, and if you didn't, there would be repercussions. And to be honest, that made us all gasp a little bit. that we were going to be subject to those constraints. In retrospect, it didn't really happen. We did feel more constrained by ABC in Boston Legal than any show I had ever worked on. We would, every show would be a bit of a battle to delve into the content that we were delving into. But I also will say at the end of the day, it was never lost on me that, you know, how lucky we are to live in the United States, that you can actually do television shows that challenge your government. There's a lot of places still where you don't get to do that. But it did change a little bit. I think now we've shifted back, and we've now returned to more of Edward R. Murrow's philosophy that, you know, not to confuse disloyalty with dissent.
You know, Larry, I was actually the classic case of somebody who was a real liberal activist. I was counsel on the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on constitutional rights. I worked in the Civil Rights Division. And one of the reasons I left Washington was I was frustrated that the world wasn't changing the way I wanted it to change. And I thought I could reach more people, I could be more impactful if I wrote for the mass media. And then I kind of underwent a change, not in my political views. My political views have remained remarkably the same. And also, I want to emphasize, I can see the other side. It's not that I dismissed the other side. I just, more often than not, would not agree with it. I wasn't an ideologue. But I think what happened to me was I became more interested in a Camryn Manheim having to play a prosecutor who's pushing for the death penalty. That conflict of somebody who doesn't believe in the death penalty but has to occupy the role of someone who does, that became more interesting, and I think more what the audience is interested in, not policy questions, but internal, personal conflict questions that are played out through stories.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank all the panel for a fantastic presentation and make a disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a physician. And admitted junkie of David Kelley's show, starting with LA Law. I own every single episode of every show you ever produced. And in fact, I watch it over and over again, especially Boston Legal in the practice. So, said that, I wanted to bring in something which was a little bit discussed among the panel members, but maybe not to the same extent I see it, and that is the humanity of the persons who are parts of each show. And that humanity and the complexity and their weaknesses, I think, in a way, are more compelling than even sometimes cases, because not every case is equally interesting to an audience. But I believe that even with all the imperfection and far-fetching, bending of the rules and really being far from the actual reality of what lawyers is, and that's maybe a question, that influences young people maybe to become lawyers for potentially a completely different reason they should. Or maybe lawyers who become different lawyers and practice law in a more humane way and not as in a law-abiding, dry-cut thing. And I can only say last thing I wanted to share with you is that as a physician who is 31 years practicing the profession, I have very hard time watching physician shows, except The House. Because on The House, as initially as I was absolutely appalled by the wrongness of the character, I finally accepted and very much admired, again, the humanity. No matter how inappropriate the medical cases are and how far from real diagnosis it is, and improbable scenarios, but I think that psychology part, the dynamic between characters, is what may actually influence public more. So this is just a question maybe more to the lawyers in the panel.
Well, you've touched on a very important nucleus for me, that being humanity. The first thing I do when I go about creating a series, the franchise itself is a device, if you will, and it's a device to explore my characters. I always start every process writing the characters, and then ultimately sort of shape a world in which, or a franchise in which they all populate. But I have, and it's, again, it's my process, I don't necessarily recommend it to others, but those people, those characters, as fictional as they are, as make-believe as they are going to be the people I spend more time with in the next 5 years than anybody else I know, with the exception of my wife and children. Those people are with me. They're in the car with me. I don't see my friends nearly enough. That's something I've tried to adjust. I do fish. But really, my best friends, the most communal part of my life takes place with these make-believe characters. And so when I start realizing I better like these people. I better write them with love, not with contempt. Many television shows start out writing, they want an edgy character and they write them with contempt, if you will, hatred. I actually so loved The Sopranos in the early years because I thought the writers loved Tony Soprano. And I drifted off in the later years because I felt they began to loathe him. And to me, what makes me love a character more than anything else is whether or not he's redeeming at the end of the day, and that comes from his sense of humanity. I would gather that's what works for you in House, because as contemptible as Dr. House is in his behavior, you forgive it because of where it comes from. Alan Shore had a lot of bad qualities. You probably wouldn't want him to date your daughter. But you were with him at the end of the day because I think of that core of humanity. Harry in Harry's Law, I think, offers the same thing. Certainly Eleanor Frutt, it rang true to her character. You forgive them, and you love them at the end of the day if you believe in them. And the best way I find to believe in people is to see that core of humanity.
I wanted to follow up a little bit on what I understood Dean Kramer's opening question was, and that is sort of the relationship between the reality and what you're portraying. I understand, for example, that you all have characters that reflect different points of view in your shows, but if you think about the lens through which the viewer sees a series, Perry Mason, we saw it through the eyes of the defense attorney, and he generally won. Law and Order, which of course has been the elephant in the room for so many years, we see the show and we see the legal system through the eyes of the prosecutors and the police. And I wonder, and obviously there are exceptions, but I wonder if, and CSI is another example, and it's well known that people talk about the CSI effect in court in actual trials. And I wonder how you think that plays in terms of what's possible to create in the future. You talk about networks and the restrictions that you operate under, and also sort of how this, in general, begins to affect our political system.
Anybody want to take that?
I'd address the CSI effect briefly. So far as I know, there is no evidence at all that there is a CSI effect. CSI effect is a series of anecdotes that got out of control, and they were told by prosecutors to journalists when the prosecutors had lost a case, didn't want to admit that it was overcharged or undertried or anything else, and they came up with an excuse, which it was the CSI effect. There have been many studies done on that that show it doesn't exist.
In terms of, I think, looking at a world through the lens of your characters, certainly, I think your audience is going to do that. It doesn't mean that we're out to prejudice the world through that lens. In other words, I can only speak for my shows, but I rarely ask the audience to accept. I guess with Boston Legal I did, and to a certain extent in Harry's Law I did, but I really rarely ask you to believe in the infallibility of our characters. And even Boston Legal I didn't, but maybe some of the arguments I was asking the audience to accept. You don't ask for that. You really ask to, again, use your character, you use an issue to explore the value system of that character. And if you get lucky, you also ask the audience, and occasion the audience to explore their value system. The most flattering compliments that we ever got on our shows is that people were fighting at home after watching it, that they heard one closing argument and some family members believed in that, other family members took the opposing point of view and saw it through the prosecutor's lens, and they fought. And through that fight and through them confronting that value system, they kind of knew more about themselves on where they stood given a particular issue. I think that's your best success. I'm not a fan of getting up on a soapbox and saying, this is right, take this, accept this. That having been said, there's no question the soapbox came out from time to time on Boston Legal.
I just want to add that we can't lose sight of the fact that there are commercial constraints, that if you're in a ratings competition, if your show audience drops too much, it gets canceled. So the audience does limit you to one degree or another on what you can get away with. Now, if your audience is loyal enough and you can count on them, then you can begin to explore. It gives you a little more license. I worked on a show, Life Goes On, and we spent pretty much, one of our characters was HIV positive and developed into full-blown AIDS. And we got to explore that dramatically for an entire season. It was very moving. And I think the people who were following our show had their opinions changed. But it always has to be thought of in the context of commercial constraints.
So I'm afraid with that, we'll have to draw this panel to a close to stay on schedule, but let's thank the panelists for a wonderful panel, and hopefully we get a chance to ask your questions after.